Welcome, everybody. I'm excited to be here. It feels like it's been an eternity since I've done a webinar. It's only been a little over a month, but I'm excited to be here. Hopefully you are as well. I know we have a large range of experience levels from folks who've never used the Nik Collection before, all the way to some experts, I'm sure, because we've got a really good crowd here today. And I'm going to show you a slide where we'll kind of go over what we're going to be talking about today. But there's two things that I want to mention about this slide specifically right now. So we are retouching sunrise and sunset images. A lot of the techniques that I'm going to show you, you don't have to use them on sunrise or sunset images. They just work well for sunrise or sunset images. I should probably do a quick introduction of myself. Lori mentioned that I have done a couple of these webinars before. I was the webinar trainer at Nik Software from 2009 to 2012, and then on into the sort of Google years, if you will, into about 2014, I had been conducting webinars. And I've done over 2,000 of these webinars. They have changed dramatically since the beginning. And you know, they're not perfect, but hopefully you get some really cool techniques and concepts out of taking your sunrise and sunset images and you know, getting a little bit more out of them. So we're going to be talking about these four things today: adding color to dull skies. We'll talk about the graduated filters. You can customize some. You customize all of them, but you can actually choose the colors you want to use in some of them, whereas some of them have some nice presets. We'll talk about those differences. And then we'll talk about how to selectively utilize control points with these filters in Color Efex Pro. And then also we'll, you know, I'll sort of pepper in some different ways of getting natural results. And the key to getting, you know, a more natural look is understanding what the different sliders in some of the graduated filter tools do, the blending, vertical shift, opacity, and rotation specifically. Cool. All right, so I'm going to be presenting from Photolab 4 for today, but the concepts that we're dealing with, and even basically the interface itself, will look and work exactly the same way, whether you're launching your Nik plugins from Lightroom or from Photoshop or some other piece of software, or even as a standalone. We're going to begin with this image, and we're just going to apply a couple filters to this photograph to hone in the color a little bit more. And we're going to be introducing you to the cross balance filter here as well, which isn't a graduated filter, but I'll talk you through that one. Let's see, any other notes on this one? Oh, so this is it's a JPEG image. I actually received this from one of my students. So I teach photography at the Rochester Institute of Photography. And I, you know, request that my students send me any images they want to once they've left for the summer. And right off the bat, Gabby Federicetti sent me these. She's a really promising student, really smart and great photographer. And this is just an image of a nice, I think this is dusk. I probably could check the metadata. Anyways, let's open the image into Color Efex Pro and actually get down to brass tacks here. So in Photolab 4, to access the Nik Collection, you move into the lower right corner of the interface, and there's a little Nik Collection button. I am in the Customize section of the interface. That's where I'm going to be working from in this webinar. So the Nik Collection button in that lower right corner is going to allow us to open up our plugin selector. So this is how you would access any of the Nik plugins that you might want to from Photolab 4. Note that there is a settings button down in the bottom. If we have any extra time at the end, I'll kind of cover some of those options as well, because they're nice to know. All right, so we're going to launch into Color Efex Pro 4. As Color Efex Pro 4 launches, what's going to happen here in Photolab, or if you were to launch from Lightroom, is the original image, usually a raw file, I would suggest, would open, sorry, a raw file would be duplicated into a TIFF file. So what you would result, or the end result would be, is you'd have two images in your Lightroom catalog or here within your Photolab library. And it's important to note that because it's parametric, we're able to work in a non-destructive workflow. And in fact, for folks who aren't familiar, I have to just mention what this tool does here, this little pop-up that just came up. This is informing us that we can work in a fully non-destructive workflow, meaning we can open this image back up into Color Efex Pro and reprocess the image, even after we've finished editing the image here within Color Efex. So it's a really nice option. This is one of the new features within the more recent version of the Nik Collection by DxO. So this is just telling us that that's what's going to happen here. I leave these prompts up so that when we have these webinars, if you've never launched the software, you're going to see this prompt as well, and you're going to have the same experience basically. So I'm going to click the OK button. That's going to pop up every time, and from now on, I'll just click the OK button on that particular one. If we get other prompts, I'll walk you through what those are doing. Okay, so we're here within Color Efex Pro 4. On the left side, we have our filter library. So this is where our 55 individual filters are. They're laid out in alphabetical order, and they allow us to sort of scroll through as we see fit. The upper left interface or portion of the interface also allows us to break the filters down into different groupings. So right now, I've sort of changed my filter library genres or prompts here, and they are set to all: favorites, film, nature, wedding, portrait, architecture, and travel. So that might be different than yours, like if you have Color Efex Pro open right now. But basically what these things do is they allow us to sort our filters by these different kinds of filters. These are ones that emulate film, or if I click on the wedding filters, these are filters that work really well for wedding photography. For the webinar today, we're gonna stick with the all prompt or the section here. And I want to do that just so that everybody has a similar experience again. Okay, so let's choose our first filter, and then we'll talk about what it's doing and how to control it. The first filter is a really wonderful color filter that allows us to shift our kind of white balance, our color response here. It's called cross balance. So we'll click on cross balance. And technically what this filter does, if you follow me into the upper right side of the interface where I have my controls for the filter, this is trying to give us a sort of throwback to the film era days where we could cross-process, or sorry, this isn't cross-process, where we could shoot one kind of film in a different kind of lighting environment. So this is a really interesting color shifting tool. It doesn't work on every kind of photography, but I really love what it does on these kinds of sunrise or sunset images, and that's primarily where I use this filter, because you can use this particular tool, tungsten to daylight number 2, and what this is going to do for us is it's going to make the image look as though we had shot with a particular white balance, tungsten, and tungsten film, and we were shooting in a daylight environment, right? So what it does is it shifts the color in a relatively interesting way. And I love the fact that I'm getting these nice cool tones up here. And that's what I want to sort of exaggerate a little bit more with a combination of filters. So with cross balance, we're getting this sort of throwback to film days, if you will. And the beauty of this is that we can control all of the facets of what this tool is doing. So, one of the limitations of shooting film for anybody who had or does is basically what you get out of camera, and in the processing, depending upon the chemistry, is what you get, unless you're doing trickery within scanning and printing. Here, one of the interesting aspects using this particular tool, Color Efex and the Nik plugins, is that we can actually apply these filters. We can control the amount that we might want with the strength slider. In this case, I'll go ahead and just bump the strength all the way up to 100%. And then if we want to, we can actually apply where the filter is being placed on the image using control points. So this next feature is one of the most important features within the Nik Collection, let alone Color Efex Pro. The control points allow us to put the filter in an area where we might want it, and it allows us to remove the filter from areas where we don't want it. So what we're going to do is use a minus control point here on the right side of the interface, and I'm going to remove the cross balance from this section down here in the bottom of the image. And we literally just click the minus control point, place the point on the object or area where we don't want the filter to be, and then I can expand the area that this control point affects. And what's happening is the control point basically makes a selection of what you've placed the point on, and it instantaneously makes a quick, very precise selection for us. So now we've removed this cross balance effect from this lower portion of the image, but we still have the cross balance effect occurring in the upper portion of the image. And in fact, to make sure of that, what I like to do, anytime I want to just see what the filter is doing, a particular filter that is, you click on the little checkbox that's to the left of the filter label. So this, as we move forward, this section here is going to become populated with filters. Right now, we just have cross balance, but we're going to add another one in a minute. And if we want to turn this filter on and off to see what it does, you click that little checkbox, and you can see the before and the after. And in this case, what cross balance is doing for us is creating a color contrast between the upper portion of the image and the lower portion of the image, which is going to give us a better sense of depth. The original photograph, while is beautiful and is what was happening in real life, according to the camera, right? It basically looked like this. You know, this is a little bit cool up here, but basically by adding our cross processing, we're able to exaggerate those contrasts, in this case, color contrast, and increase the sort of sense of depth that we get from the photo. To take that one step further, we're going to click the Add Filter button. That's going to button up our cross balance filter. And if you follow me back over to the left side of the interface, we're going to add in our graduated filter, right? So there are several graduated filters. We're going to talk about most of them. The graduated filter itself, if I click on it, what it does is it applies a by default, blue graduated color filter. And by default, the blue and the strength of the effect is very strong at the top, and then as it moves down into the image, the effect is weaker, or there's less of the effect rather. So we're not gonna leave this color set to blue. We're actually gonna end up using orange number 4. But let's walk through each one of these different things, because these are some of the more important filters for this webinar. The graduated filter is a set of color presets that by default, you know, create this blue gradient from the top into the middle. But if you click on your color set drop-down menu, you can scroll through and get what's called as a heads-up display on the image applied. So you can see exactly what's going to happen with these different colors. And in my mind, most of them aren't working particularly well. And actually, I'm going to customize the filter to get it exactly where we want it to be. Before I do that, we're going to leave this on the default color, blue 1. And the reason I want to do that is to walk you through opacity, blend, vertical shift, and rotation. Because these 4 sliders are the slider controls that you have within basically all of the graduated filter tools and the bicolor filters as well. Which is what we're talking about, right? So the opacity slider is the sort of most straightforward in my mind. It's the strength, right? If I bring it down to 0, none of that graduated color is going to be applied. If I bring it up to 100, it's a very strong application of that filter. And in this case, basically blacks out the top of the image. The next, which we're not going to leave it here. I'm just going to leave it there for a second so that we can get a good idea of what these other sliders are doing. The blend slider is the actual gradient itself, right? So if I bring the blend down to 0, there's basically no gradient between where the graduated filter is applied and where it's not. If you slide that blend slider up, you're going to get a softer gradation, and you can basically set that to whatever's appropriate for your image. I'm going to leave it at 0 for right now, because it allows me to show you the vertical shift and the rotation very easily. By the way, anytime we're messing around with these sliders, it's not hurting the image at all to just slide opacity for all the way left and all the way right. And if anything, it's a really good way to kind of figure out what's happening with that particular slider. So if any of these filters are new and you want to see what one of these sliders does, just slide it all the way to the right and slide it all the way to the left. You'll get a good idea of what's happening, and then you can kind of customize it to exactly how you want the filter to be applied. The vertical shift is how far into the middle or how far down the image the graduated filter is going to be applied, right? So at 50%, cuts the image right down the middle, basically. At 100%, it covers the entire image. So you can kind of set it wherever fits the photograph. And in this case, we're actually going to adjust this in just a minute, but I'll leave it at 39 right now. Okay, rotation. This last slider by default is set to 180. So this is it's degrees, 180 degrees, and apparently what that means with these filters is that, sorry, I zoomed in, is that the top of the image has the strongest application, and as we move down into the photograph, there's that gradation occurring. Now with rotation, if I go ahead and just click on that slider, we can actually rotate it to be any angle we might want. So in a lot of situations, you don't want the gradation or the rotation to be set at 180. Maybe many of them you do, and that's why it's a great default setting, but sometimes you might want it at 219, right? Or at 360. And in fact, in this case, we do want it at 360, because what we're going to do, I'm going to turn off the filter for a second, is we're going to change the color of the horizon area to be much more red than it is right now. So we're doing that with this graduated filter. So we'll check it on. We're going to go to color set, and we're going to go down to orange number 4. Now, this looks crazy. It kind of looks interesting. There's definitely a cool graphic aesthetic going on here because of the way that overlay is occurring. But if we wanted to make it look a little bit more natural and realistic, what we're going to do is maybe blend the effect, right? So it kind of moves, the gradation blends into the now top of the image. I'm actually going to take the vertical shift and I'm going to move it down just a little bit more. And then we're going to take the opacity and we're just going to lower the opacity so that we just have, the exact amount of this red graduated filter applied to our image. And now what we've done with our graduated filter and our cross balance filter is we've added even more color contrast to the entire image. So if we turn off the filters by clicking that little checkbox, we can see the original image. If we check that back on, we can see our enhanced image. And in fact, if you want to take a look at the before and after, you can actually do that a couple different ways. I'll show you 3 more ways to do that. Right now, I'm just going to click the compare button. So if you follow my cursor into the upper left corner of the interface, if I click and hold the compare button, that's going to show me the original image. And if I let go, I'm going to see my enhanced image. So in this case, we've used the 2 filters to sort of increase just the color contrast and yield a little bit more depth overall in the photograph. And the beauty of this, I'm going to click on a side-by-side. With these 2 filters, so I've clicked on the side-by-side preview. On the left side here, I have the original image. On the right side, I've got the enhanced image with our filters. And if you kind of lean back in your chair, I think your eye is probably going to be attracted a little bit more towards that right side photograph because of these color differences that we've brought out with just these 2 filters. And that's sort of the intention in this case of these processes. So I'm going to click the save button in the lower right corner of the interface. That's going to bring us back over into PhotoLab, and it's going to save our image as our separate file, right? So in PhotoLab, which is going to work in a very similar way to Lightroom, we have our original image, and then we have our enhanced image in the same folder and saved right next to it. Moving on, our next photograph. We're going to move over to one more image and work with what I would say a relatively simple workflow, and that is we're just going to apply a couple filters, maybe use a few control points, and this is going to, again, bring out this really beautiful color contrast. This is just a different image, and in this case, this was dusk, and this was the raw file straight out of camera. I think I might have shifted the white balance a little bit, and then we have the defaults that are applied within Photolab as well, but that's all that's been done to the image. We're going to go into the Nik collection, and in this case, we're going to try out the Brilliance and Warmth filter, which is a very, very powerful tool, which only has 3 sliders, which is wonderful because it does great stuff, but it's very simple to use. And so here's that prompt again. It's just letting us know that we can work in the non-destructive process. By the way, if you ever want to use this tool, which it's a fantastic tool so that you can, again, open the image back up after you've adjusted and saved your image, what you would do is just click the little checkbox that's in the lower right corner of the interface. If this checkbox is on, save and edit later, that's going to basically allow you to save as a TIFF file that has its own internal sidecar, which basically means it can be relaunched into the Nik collection tool that you used. Okay, so let's start on the left side with the Brilliance and Warmth filter. And we're going to use this several times. In my mind, it's the most powerful color filter tool that's within Color Efex Pro that I use on all sorts of different kinds of images constantly. So in this case, what we're going to do is increase the perceptual saturation and then probably even increase a little bit of the regular saturation as well. So what we'll do is just sort of see what it does, right? So I'll increase perceptual saturation a lot. And then, you know what, let's warm the image a touch. And then the problem that I'm running into is the sky above the mountain, in my mind, looks relatively realistic, right? That looks like it's a color that could occur. And this water probably could occur as well. But if we look at the before and after, I've added quite a lot of that perceptual saturation and substantially warmed up the water as well. So I don't really want all of that effect in there. So we're going to go back to those control points. And in this case, we're going to use a series of minus control points to remove most of that brilliance and warmth effect just from the water, right? And so here's this technique. You click on the minus control point and you place that point exactly where you want it to be, right? And so that minus control point is going to look for the object that you've placed the point on, and it's going to, in this case, because it's a minus control point, remove the effect. Now, if I increase the size of the area, sure, that's going to remove the effect from all of this stuff, but it's also going to remove that brilliance and warmth filter, or whatever filter you're using, from other parts of the image that the control point thinks it should be controlling, in this case, removing the filter from. So a little bit more of a precise way of working in this situation is to actually use smaller control points and to use a bunch of them, right? So we could, every time we wanted a control point, hit the minus control point on the right side of the interface and just place the point where we want it to be, right? But there's a few faster ways of working. And in fact, what we'll do is duplicate these minus control points into a line. And to do that, you hold the Option key down if you're on a Mac, or Alt if you're on a PC. And while you're holding the Option key down, or Alt, click and drag the control point away. So I'm holding Alt, click and drag my control point, and that's going to give me a duplicated minus control point, which is going to yield me the same size control point. And then had we adjusted the opacity slider within the control point, it's also going to duplicate that effect, right? Because in a control point, you can change the size of the area that it's going to affect, and then you can change the strength of the control point itself. A minus control point is going to be set to 0%, so it removes the filter effect. You can bring that up any percentage between 0 and 100%, right? So if we wanted some of this brilliance and warmth, maybe 20%, we could go ahead and set it at 20 or 20-ish percent or so, and voila, now this control point has 20%. But the rest of these control points don't. So what we're going to do is group the control points together so that they'll all kind of operate as if they're one control point. There's actually 2 different ways to do that. Here's one of those ways. So if you want to group control points, you have to first, wow, I can't speak at all. You have to first activate the control points. And so to activate the control points, you can either click and hold Shift, right? And this works in your Windows and Mac operating system if you're going to want to highlight multiple files or something, and maybe drag them somewhere, I don't know. And then the other way to do it is the same way as you might do this inside of your Windows or Mac operating system in a folder. You can literally just click anywhere that's not on one of those files, one of these control points, and drag. So if you click and drag, it creates this little bounding box. When you let go of the mouse, it's going to allow you to control those control points all at one time. And in fact, to kind of group them permanently, what you'll do is you'll move into the right side of the interface. I shouldn't say permanently, it's not permanent, because you can undo it if you want to. But if you open up into your control points section here, and you move to the bottom portion of the control points section, you can click this button right here when you've got a bunch of control points selected, and that groups them together. So now I can control this one control point, and it's going to affect all of those points, right? So this one set of sliders, opacity and even size, will affect all of those control points. Now, that was a kind of a lot to take in, I think. I actually want to group this point as well. So what we'll do is we'll click on our grouped control point and then hold Shift, click on this one, and then I'll just click the group button again, and now that one's grouped as well. So it's a really handy tool to be able to group these and control them like this. And so that might be a little bit advanced if you've never seen the tools before, but note that you can learn with the tools. You can apply these filters globally, and or you can apply them selectively using control points like this. All right, so we've talked so much about control points. Let's sort of take a look at what's happening here with the image. I think I'm going to take a plus control point and let's place it here in the orange and just expand that out. And you'll say, well, Dan, why on earth would you use one big control point here where you use a bunch of small control points there? Well, in this case, these small control points need to stay small and only really affect this area. Whereas this one large control point, I don't mind it kind of going everywhere because I want the filter effect basically everywhere else within the image. So I feel confident that that's going to do what I need it to do. Now, if you're not confident or in what the filter is doing or the control point is doing, and you want to see what the tool is doing, you go back into the control points section, which, by the way, if you missed it, and I don't think I even mentioned it, to open into your control point list, you literally click on the words control points on the right side here of the interface. So you click on that, and that's going to give you a list of your control points as well as your grouping tool and so on. Now, control point number 9, that is the big control point that we just placed in there. If I were to move over to the right side of that interface and click on that little checkbox, this is telling us, as we click on that, exactly where the filter is being applied and where it's not. So this control point is placing the filtered effect anywhere that's white, and then these control points are doing a nice job to kind of remove the filtered effect for you. And then this portion of the mountains in Turkey, those are getting some of the application of the filter. And depending upon your opacity, you'll get more or less, right? So you can click on the opacity. And literally what this is showing you is the mask that this control point is affecting, right? So white reveals, anything that was white there is going to have the filtered application. Anything that was black has none of the filtered application. I'll show you that. And then anything that's gray has some of it. All right. Brilliance and warmth, and a lot on control points there. So we're finished with brilliance and warmth. We're going to click the add filter button, and we're going to add the graduated user-defined filter. So follow me to the left-hand side of the interface. On the last image, we used the graduated filters, and that had that series of preset colors, right? If I click on it, I've got a nice set of presets within the color set. The user-defined option basically does the same thing, except it allows us to choose any color we might want. So there are benefits to each one. The graduated filters, the other filter that we used a minute ago, that works really well with those presets because there are predetermined colors that Nik software knows is going to work really well. The graduated user defined filter is really great because you get to decide what you're using it for and what color is going to be applied. But the problem is you can choose not so great colors, right? Because like this red one, this looks okay here, I guess. But if I go and I click on the color swatch itself, this is going to open up my color picker. And if you're on a PC, this color picker is going to look very different than if you're on a Mac. But you can basically decide any color you might want. And it's easy to decide on a color, but it's hard to get a really beautiful color, right? So right now I've set this to gray. If I close this, now I have a gray sky, which is fine, right? But that's not what we want in this case. I think we want, let's say, like a purple sky. So what we'll do is we'll click on that color swatch again, which, by the way, you have a color swatch, which allows you to choose whatever color you might want in the entire color wheel, or the color wheel that Apple or Windows has available to you anyways. Or the color picker here allows you to actually choose a color that's in the image. Right, so I can actually choose the color, that color that's right in the photograph. We'll use that later in the webinar. For now, we're actually going to click on the color swatch itself, and let's just choose a purple color. So I'm going to mess around with my red, green, and blue slider, and that looks good, but maybe we want it a little bit darker. See what that does. We're going to get this nice magenta purple sky. So once we've chosen the color, you just close the color picker. Oof, that's very strong. You see what I mean? Like you can choose any color you want, and so sometimes it doesn't work particularly well. I think in this case it actually will. I just need to remove the opacity. So I just need to remove some of that effect, maybe down to 9. If it were all the way up at 100%, we could get a really interesting graphic effect out of that. But in this case, I think it needs to be lower to get a more realistic, natural kind of color combination. So I bring the opacity down. I like the blend at 100% in this case. I think it works well with that sky. I'm going to bring my vertical shift down just a touch, and I'm going to leave the rotation alone. And let's just take a look at that before and after by clicking the compare button. There's the original. Here's the enhanced. Maybe it's a little too much color still, but that's the beauty. That part's completely subjective. It's up to you. And I would say it's probably up to how you're going to output the image. If you put a photograph on, let's say, Instagram or Facebook, more saturated colors usually garner a more positive response. But if you were to try to print this image, maybe I need to be a little bit more subtle or maybe a little bit more precise to get the exact color combination I want so that the print comes out the way that would be most effective. So there are things to kind of think about in that regard. Anyways, I'm going to click the add filter button. We're just going to add one more filter. We're going to use the tonal contrast filter to bring out a little bit of detail in the sky and in the mountains right in here, because there's this really nice layering of these mountains, and I want to kind of exaggerate that a little bit. So follow me to the left side of the interface. We're going to scroll down, and I'm going to add tonal contrast. The tonal contrast by default, much like many of these filters, might have a very transformative effect on the image, right? But don't let that sort of thing scare you away. It definitely turns me away from some of the filters like dark contrasts and even, pastel. But if you put in a little bit of time knowing what that filter kind of does, you can get some really amazing applications of these tools that will really bring out, in this case, texture or exaggerate the depth that's within the mountains in the background. The thing is, you got to play a little bit. There are presets and there are tons of recipes that are built into Color Efex Pro 4. They do a great job, but if you spend a little bit of time and play around with, let's say, these contrast types and say, okay, balanced looks pretty interesting in the mountains back there. So as I click on balanced, maybe I just decide to remove a little bit of the midtone contrast and a little bit of the highlights contrast to reduce it overall. Let's just take a look at the before and after. There's the before tonal contrast. There's the after. I like what it's doing. I don't know if we need the added saturation because we've already gone in and controlled all of those facets. So I'll go to the saturation slider. I'm just going to click on the number. So you can click on these numbers and you can type in any number you want. So I'll type in 0, And now I'm not changing the saturation with the tonal contrast filter, but I am getting a little bit more contrast in texture and depth out of the mountains. I like what it's doing, but I only want it in the mountains. So this is where we're going to use plus control points, right? So we used minus control points earlier to remove the filter effect from the water. And in this case, what we'll do is we'll use a plus control point or a couple of plus control points to apply the filter exactly where we want it to be and nowhere else, right? So this is going to create this little bit of exaggerated contrast. And now you can actually get a sense of the depth of the mountain here. You can see where there's a little line, and then it's been exaggerated a little bit using that tonal contrast filter. So in this case, it's subtle, but it's very effective in being able to kind of really bring out all of those attributes of the image. So here's the original photograph, and then we've applied brilliance and warmth, graduated to user defined, where we chose our color, in this case, a really strong purple, and then the tonal contrast filter. To finish, we're going to click the save button. And I'm going to adjust my notes here, and we're going to move into the next image. Oh, cool. Okay. So again, here's our original image, and here's our enhanced image. I think my purple application was maybe a little bit too strong in that case, but it works well for demonstration purposes. Okay, so this is the next image we're going to take a look at, and we're slowly getting sort of more complicated and complex with our application of the tools. So what we're going to do is, this is the original. There you go. And then here's the enhanced, and this is how, or basically what's going to happen when we finish the image. For now, I'm going to remove this filter or this image from my library, the finished image, because we're going to make a new one, and I don't want two of them in here. So I've just right-clicked on my image. I'm going to click remove, and that'll just get rid of it out of my Photolab library. All right, so we've got our photograph. We're going to click on the Nik Collection. We'll go into our Color Efex Pro 4. And we're going to start out talking about the bicolor filter. So kind of like the graduated filters and then the graduated filter with the user defined option, there's a bicolor filter, and then there's a bicolor filter user defined as well. Okay, so there's our little option saying, yep, we can work in a totally non-destructive process. And we're going to start with the bicolor filter. We're going to actually end up using bicolor user defined because I want to walk us through both of those. But these filters work almost exactly the same way. The difference between bicolor and graduated filter is that we have two colors being applied, one from the top and then the other from the bottom up by default. So with the bicolor filters, you have a series of heads up presets, so you can just scroll over each one, and these are all presets that work pretty darn well for different kinds of photographs. And they are the colors that would respond in a pleasing way without much work, right? That's sort of the idea of having these preset in here, and oftentimes they work perfectly. I've definitely used this cool warm option several times on different photographs, and then I've used the violet and pink on other photographs. For now, though, we're going to replace the bicolor filter with the bicolor user defined, because I'm going to show you this application, and I want to do it in a little bit more of a funky way than what we did before. We're actually going to use two of the same color, basically, to get a kind of interesting effect that one gradiates into the other. So it's kind of fun because it's a different way of thinking about using the filter itself. So just like our graduated filters, you have opacity, which is the strength. Just bring that all the way up for now. The blend, which is the gradient between the top and the bottom. The vertical shift, right? So we can maybe set that right at the horizon if we wanted to. And then the rotation, which we're going to leave at 180, but you can see what happens when we rotate it. Now, by default, the upper color is going to be, I think this is the default setting anyways, blue, and then the lower color is orange. But what you can do is actually click on your color drop or the color picker option, which turns your cursor into a little color picker. And we're going to do a little experiment here. So usually what I do to use this filter is I click on the eyedropper, and then I actually turn off my filter, and then I choose the color that I want with the filter off. And that, I think, is what we're going to end up doing. But let's try a little experiment. So we're going to have the filter on, and then we're going to click the color picker. And then let's see what happens if I choose down here, which in the original image is blue, but with the filter applied is red. I don't remember what happens. Yeah, okay, well, that's cool looking, but what's happening now is when I use the color picker, it's choosing the color that it sees on screen, not necessarily the color that's in the original image. So I guess what I'd like for you to do is note that if you want a color that's showing up on the screen afterwards, and you can leave the filter on. If you want to choose a color that exists in the image already, what you're going to want to do is turn the filter off and then click on the color picker and then choose your color. So I'm going to choose blue here. I'll turn it on. Let's see what happens. Great, that's pretty close to what I want. And then in the lower portion, let's just choose a color. So we're going to click on the actual color swatch itself, the sort of little orange filter right now. We click on that, and we're going to choose a slightly darker blue color. So we're going to manufacture that. Oh, which, by the way, I keep using the red, green, and blue slider. It's just one of the ways of choosing your colors. This also has a color picker in it, and then it also has the ability to go to a color wheel where you can kind of move the color wheel around anywhere you want it to be. So it works basically the same way. Whatever the color swatch is in the lower left corner is what it's the color that will end up being applied by that portion of the filter. So I guess it's sort of an important aspect to note. If you haven't used that a whole bunch before, which, yeah. Okay, so I'm choosing a slightly darker blue color. I'm going to close that. And then I think that's actually too much saturation. So should you decide that you don't like it, you can just click on the color dropper or the eyedropper or the color swatch again. And in this case, I want it a little bit less saturated, so I'm going to move it towards the middle. And if it's directly in the middle, you're going to get gray. And the further out from the center is the more saturated colors. So we'll choose a little bit less saturated blue. And we're going to end up removing some of the opacity. But for now, we're going to blend this. So we have two color blues. They're slightly different. And this will end up being this nice sort of subtle application of the bicolor filter. And as we start to exaggerate more colors using other filters, we'll get some really cool opportunities here. So bicolor user defined, we chose our two colors. I'm actually going to click the minus control point, and I'm going to remove it from the sunset itself. So we don't have any of the application from the sunset, and maybe even, no, I'll leave it in the water. So those are minus control point, removing it from the sunset. From there, we'll click the add filter button. And I know I'm coming up on time. We've got several more things that I wanted to talk about. We'll use Brilliance and Warmth again in this case. And since we've used this filter before, I'm just going to do it quickly. I'm going to increase the perceptual saturation quite a bit. I'm going to warm the image just a bit as well. And then I'm going to, are we increasing saturation? No, I'm not going to increase the saturation because we've done that with Brilliance and Warmth. Okay, so now from there, what I might do, because I'm now warming the image and adding this perceptual saturation, which is kind of the opposite of what we did with the bicolor user defined, is I'm just going to take minus control points and I'm going to remove it from some of the areas where I want the color to be a little bit more blue. The reason I might want some of these colors to be a little bit more blue is we are generating this color contrast, right? So having the blue colors in the areas maybe where I don't want you to pay as much attention, and then having the nice contrasting warm colors, in the sunset itself, and then also maybe in some of the clouds, the highlights of the clouds. Now we're getting this really wonderful contrasting sets of colors. And this is going to yield us this really wonderful depth. It's almost like a tunnel view now, right? Because we've got the sun setting in the, behind the clouds there. In the background, you've got this couple that are sort of blurred because of the long exposure. And then we have this really nice blue color and tone that we're exaggerating by, oops, I don't want those there. I want minus control points. Sorry about that. Minus control point right there. Cool. And then a plus control point right here. Nice. Okay. Brilliance and Warmth with a pretty extensive set of control points applied. plus control points, placing the warmth where we want it, minus control points, removing it from the areas we don't. So one more filter we'll use here, maybe two, the colorize filter. Now, the colorize filter is an overall color shift, right? And so the default here has made the whole image much more sort of desaturated and more blue and cool. And what we're going to do is use a different method. So every one of these different kinds of color applications and color filters will have a drop-down menu like this, or most of them will anyways. And this is going to allow you to choose these different methods. So like method, I don't know technically what all of the methods do from memory anyways. But method number 5 starts out by desaturating the entire image to black and white, and then putting your color over the image. So that could be an interesting way of working. The other filters are using different kinds of blendings to kind of apply the color in a different way. It's different math to get it exactly where it wants to be. And what I want to do here is I'm going to use method number 1, but we're going to sample our sky here, some of the more saturated area. And then I'm going to increase the strength, but I'm only going to apply the effect in some of the areas where I know I want it. So I want it in the water here, just to sort of exaggerate some of that colorization. Again, to kind of draw your attention as the viewer in towards those warm areas. And then also I'll put it into the sky here. So this is kind of lowering the contrast of the sky, right? And again, depending upon what you might do with the image, if I were to post this on Instagram or online, it would probably have more impact to have that area be light and white. But if I'm printing the image, I might want some more value in there instead of it being really white in there. And so by adding in this colorization, now I have a little bit more tone and color in there, and therefore I'm going to get a more, excuse me, I'm going to get a more successful print in my mind. Again, obviously it depends on what you're going to be doing, but I like that colorize filter for that purpose. It gives us some tone in those highlight areas that are maybe a little bit too bright. We're going to finish this image off using Pro Contrast. It is a very powerful filter that only has 3 sliders. It allows us to correct any color cast that might be on the image. Actually, in this case, it does some interesting stuff as I bring the correct color cast slider up. And then I'm going to add a little bit of dynamic contrast as well. Now, I'm coming up on our time. I understand that. So I'm going to kind of cut us loose here. I just want to show you one more before and after. So we used several filters in this case, the bicolor, user defined, brilliance and warmth, colorize, and pro contrast. And we basically just brought out and exaggerated the colors that were basically already there. And this is actually closer to the way I remember this scene being when I shot the image, right? Of course, my memory is probably flawed, but shooting a raw file straight out of camera, that's going to yield me as much information as that camera can. And oftentimes it's going to look a little bit flat and oftentimes possibly desaturated right out of camera. It does depend upon what software you're using to process the image, of course, and so on. But by using these 4 filters in this case, I've got the application that I want that I think really works well for this image. I'm all done editing, so I'm going to click the Save button. And I'm going to throw it back over to Lori to see if we have any questions that I can
We
answer.
do, Dan. We have a couple questions. The first one is, what is the difference between saturation and perceptual saturation?
That's a fantastic question. The way that I think of it might be technically different than the actual definition. So I'm going to give you, 2 opportunities here. The way that I think of perceptual saturation is it is a tool that exaggerates the hue of the color more so than the actual saturation of the color. And what that means is if you think of saturation as a volume, as sort of the amount of color, if you will, you can turn up the color or you can turn down the color with saturation. The perceptual saturation will actually look at the image and shift the hue of the color so that what was this color orange is now a more yellow orange, and what was, what this blue color was is now a more cyan blue, and you'd get something like this, right? And that's how I think of perceptual saturation. But if we jump over into my Google Chrome, so I open up my browser here. We're at the Nik Collection website. This is where you can see any of the upcoming webinars as well as recorded webinars. But if you go to the Nik software website and you want to learn more about what every one of these different filters can do, or if you have a very specific slider that you want to learn more about, if you go to the Explore section and then you go to Customer Support, it brings you to this really handy help page that can be overwhelming at first because there's a ton of information. But what you'll do is scroll down to the Color Efex Pro section and then click into Filters. You got to do a couple things. You have to click into Filters, and then you have to click on View Page because there's a ton of information in here. So when you click on View Page here, this opens up the page, and this has a listing of every single filter that's within Color Efex Pro. And here is the Brilliance and Warmth filter, which has the definition of perceptual saturation, which this is the technical way of thinking about it, right? I sort of conceptualized it myself and then, spit it out at you, but technically perceptual saturation is not necessarily increasing just saturation, it alters the hue of the color and so on. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but this is great information. And if you have specific questions about those sliders, that's a really great place to find that information.
It is indeed. Okay, question number 2. Does the order of the filters override the filters above it? So when you're
Great question.
Yeah.
Yes, it absolutely does. So the order that you apply the filters will yield you a different aesthetic result. And I word it that way because, you might have, well, you definitely have friends, right? You might have a friend who's using Color Efex Pro and they tell you to use 3 or 4 different filters, but if they put them in a different order than you put them in, you actually do get a different response. And so I'll show you that here. I'm going to just add a couple random filters. Let's put Glamour Glow on the image, and then let's put, I don't know what else. I'm just going to go with those 2 for now. And then let's add one more filter, because this happens a lot with tonal contrast. If you put tonal contrast at the bottom of your stack of filters, it'll actually look different than if you put it at the top of the stack. So the order does matter, although you can't go wrong really, it's whatever you like. But something like tonal contrast, if you're getting maybe a too transformative of an effect, even for what, when you adjust the settings, what you can do is click on any of your filters and reorder them, right? So if you click and drag, so you click on the title itself and drag it to the top, as I let go, watch the image, it'll re-render and it'll actually, or probably anyways, will look different than this. Yeah, it's subtle in this case, but it does look different. Now, the order does matter. And in this case, of course, I just also need to dial down the effect. Cool.
Okay, let's see here. 2 more questions. Here's one. What happens if you've already modified one control point and then you add it to a group?
What happens? So, oh, I see. So, good question. I think it gets overridden. So let's see. If I take this opacity, which is at 0, and I bring it up to 49%, and then I go and highlight this image or this control point, and I group them, what's happening is this control point just was overridden. It was at 0, and now it's going to be at 49. Yeah. So whatever you, technically, this, I call it a master control point. This control point, which is slightly bigger than a regular non-grouped control point, you can see there's this little size difference. We'll just compare the 2. And then this is the master control point, and then this would be sort of, if you will, the slave or the one that's being used in tandem with the master control point or control points. It basically adheres to whatever that master control point is. I don't have a better way of wording that. Yeah.
Okay. Last question here. A couple people are asking, you may have gone over this already, but with Photolab, is there any editing you do in Photolab before you go into Nik?
Great question. Yes, absolutely. So a lot of times in these webinars, we're only, I have 4 points to cover, and we just got through those 4 points. We could spend hours in here talking about all of the different processes and ways of going about things and thinking about things. There's 2 schools of thought in regards to, would you adjust the image beforehand before bringing it into the Nik collection? There's one school of thought is no, you don't do anything. You just kind of let the software do what it wants to do, and then you open into the Nik collection. I don't subscribe to that necessarily. I try to process the image in my raw software to get it as close to, or at least set up for, the Nik collection. So that it's close to whatever I want my final output to be. And then I use the Nik collection to kind of massage the tones to get it where I need it, knowing the tools that I'd like to use for that particular image. Yeah, so I do tend to do a good amount of work. For these webinars, we're not able to really get into most of that kind of stuff. We'd need 3 hours. We'd do an hour on the raw processing, we do an hour introducing into the filters, and then when we do an hour playing with them together. But yeah, so one last part, we didn't get to talk about this image, and it's something that I'd like for you to think about as well. With sunrise and sunset photographs, oftentimes you will want to shoot an HDR exposure series because of the difference between the brightness of the sun rising or setting compared to the scene that you're shooting, right? And in this case, this is a 7-image exposure series, and then the original HDR image looked like this, and then I went and exaggerated the heck out of the color doing this as well, which actually I printed an image that was very similar to this on a matte paper, and the matte made it slightly less saturated because of the way that the image was translated into print, and then the way that it laid on the paper itself, and it made for a really beautiful matte print, even though on screen the saturation maybe was a little bit out of hand. Okay, one more question, Lori, before we go.
That was it for now.
Oh, okay. Sure.
I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you, Dan, for a fantastic presentation.
Thank you, Lori. Yeah, that was fun. I really like this. I mean, I love giving any of these webinars, but this one was particularly fun for me because I don't usually think in this way in terms of, put a group of sunrise or sunset images together and then put some, talk about those particular filters that you might use for it. So this was a really fun webinar for me, and hopefully that translated for you as well. But have an absolutely fantastic weekend, ladies and gentlemen. Enjoy your software. If you can get out and shoot, do get out and shoot. Maybe get up and shoot dawn tomorrow if it's already past your dusk time. We're here in New York, it's only 4, so we've got a couple hours to shoot for dusk. And I'm actually headed out to photograph with a student who just graduated from the fine art program. So before he leaves, we'll do one more shoot together, and then he moves off to Notre Dame to get his graduate degree. But anyways, ladies and gentlemen, have a wonderful weekend and enjoy your software. Thanks a lot.